Okay, I would like to throw out, I don't know if anyone has a pen here. I guess we could give you pens and paper. I don't know how good everyone's memory is, but I'd like to ask 6 questions and let each of you pick the question you'd like to answer. So each person answer one. If someone would like to comment on someone else, that's fine. But I'd like to throw out 6 questions, and then please comment on whichever one you are most drawn to. And if you want to raise your hand, if you want a pen and paper, we'll get someone to get it to you.
Can we assign somebody to remember one question and have 6?
Just get a pen and paper. Okay, here are the 6 questions. First question. Michael Moss, author of Salt, Sugar, Fat, said that every major U.S. food company designs food we can't stop eating. Please explain this. Question 2. There was a study from March 4th, 2014 by Selma Tassel Morgan Levine that showed animal protein caused a 75% increase in death and a 400% increase in cancer over an 18-year follow-up. And these findings were not, okay, with the 18-year follow-up, and please explain this. That was the second question. Third question, explain what the EPIC Oxford Health Study was and what its conclusions were, and was this an important study? Fourth question, should we eat bone broth? Fifth question, in the 1950s, why were there 10 times more people in Loma Linda, California, who lived to over 100 than there were in Los Angeles? And 6, is it true that the egg industry sponsored 92% of this egg studies since 1990? Let me quickly repeat this. The first question was Michael Moss saying that the major U.S. food companies designed food that we can't stop eating. Please explain it. The second one was Selma Tassel's Morgan Levine's study showing that animal protein caused a 75% increase in death and 400% increase in cancer over an 18-year follow-up. The third is explain what the EPIC Oxford Health Study was and what its conclusions were. The fourth was, should we eat bone broth? The fifth was, why were there 10 times more people in Loma Linda who lived to over 100 than Los Angeles? And the sixth was, is it true that the egg industry sponsored 92% of the egg studies since 1990? As a goal, we would try to answer each of these questions in 3 minutes or less. And whoever wants to go, just hit the button, talk, and then...
I don't know whether you want us to go in order. I'll do question 1.
Okay, whatever you...
You went 2. All right. Question 1, Michael Moss. So quickly, Moss is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist. Wrote Salt, Sugar, Fat, came out, I believe, in 2013, thereabouts. Has since written another book, Hooked. And Salt, Sugar, Fat was excerpted in a New York Times Magazine cover story entitled The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. So you can just Google that, get the whole article, get it, read it. But the interesting thing about Moss telling us how the food supply is willfully engineered to be addictive is that he was not the first. Almost 10 years earlier, there was a 4-part expose in the Chicago Tribune entitled Obesity, the Oreo, and Us. The 4th entry in the 4-part expose was, where there's smoke, there may be food research too. That story was that 3 million pages of documents were acquired under subpoena by the state attorneys general in a class action lawsuit against Big Tobacco. What these investigative journalists were surprised to discover was documentation that had previously been proprietary, showing that the holding company, Altria, was parent to both Kraft and Philip Morris, and that Kraft scientists and Philip Morris scientists had been given marching orders to work together. Here's the functional MRI machine, you both use it. On the Philip Morris side, we want you to figure out what to put into cigarettes to get young people hooked. And on the Kraft side, we want you to figure out what to put into food so people can't stop eating what we sell them until their arm gets tired from lifting it to their mouths. 4-part expose, Chicago Tribune. 10 years later, Michael Moss, Pulitzer Prize in tow, tells us the same story again. Every major food company, U.S. around the world, has teams of scientists, functional MRI machines, and marching orders to design food people can't stop eating because it lights up the appetite center in the hypothalamus like a Christmas tree, and we health professionals are busy preaching portion control. So first of all, you should be outraged Where is the outrage, right? I mean, we've been told it's hiding in plain sight. Your food supply is willfully engineered to make you fat and diabetic for the sake of corporate profit. Where the hell is the outrage? But secondly, there's a very simple remedy. Eat whole foods. They can't muck around with whole foods.
Hit the button, hit the button.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll take bone broth for $100. Sorry, we didn't get instructions on the button. Yeah, I grew up in a home where chicken soup was fairly holy. There is, I'm aware, somewhere in the medical literature, a short study that suggests if you have a viral illness, chicken soup may shorten the duration of it. I would argue it's probably the carrots and the parsnip, but we don't have much. Then bone broth, for reasons I'm not completely clear, has screamed into the integrative medicine, functional medicine, naturopathic world. And as you know from any vitamin or health food store, there's rows and rows of turmeric bone broth. They're all dried powders, cacao bone broth. You know, the natural inclination is to go to the medical literature, and at least 3 months ago, last time I looked, there remained a single article. It was chicken bone broth. You can also do it organic from marrow. And the only thing they reported was that the lead content of the broth was very high because we all store lead in our bones, and if we cook them long enough, whether they be human, I don't suggest, calf, cow, chicken, and such, it will apparently release lead. Now, all the companies claim they test and that they can verify. I don't know if all the companies, but some of the companies actually are aware of the article and verify it. Beyond that therapeutic, it's testimonial, and you don't throw out testimonial, but you ask, what's the mechanism? I mean, collagen is created in the body. Linus Pauling taught us from vitamin C and lysine. We get vitamin C and lysine from whole fruits and vegetables. We can make collagen on plant diets, maybe make it more efficiently on plant diets. And whatever collagen is in the bone broth has to be broken down by enzymes into their more constituent parts to be absorbed. Then the body's going to use those parts for whatever it's needed. It isn't like it's earmarked, goes right back to your skin and takes your wrinkles away. It's not quite that nanobot right to your forehead or some such thing. You know, Botox broth might be a better idea. So I'm skeptical. On the other hand, you can make amazing vegetable mirepoix. I'm stealing a wife of David Katz term, Catherine Katz and such. But you can make beautiful broths from vegetables. I think I'd recommend that highly to any of my patients. It's just one of those things. It's a huge industry. You know, people talk about, just to discuss you, tail to snout use of animals. Part of it is there's higher glycine in the hoofs, so I'm going to make you all get nauseated and throw up. But apparently you might actually access some more nutrients to improve your collagen internally with that approach. But I'll eat from the beginning to the end of the carrot without reservation, but not the pig or the cow. But I say no, it's bogus.
I guess since we're at this end of the table, I'll take the Epic Oxford question. Epic Oxford...
keep about 6 inches from the mic.
Yeah. Epic Oxford was a study out of the UK that followed about 65,000 individuals, recruited them between 1993 and 1999, I believe. And these were all relatively health-conscious individuals, comparing meat eaters with semi-vegetarians, with pesco-vegetarians, with lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and vegans. And what this study essentially did, they were controlling, these were all health-conscious individuals, they were controlling for how much people smoke, how much alcohol they drink, how much they exercise, to make it a very, very fair comparison. And then they followed these individuals and are still following these individuals, so have been following them for many years to see who develops what diseases. And one thing that I need to say is the vegetarians in this particular cohort, I don't think were eating really a whole food, plant-based diet. They weren't terribly conscious about their B12 intakes, not terribly conscious about iodine intakes. So I don't think it was an ideal plant-based diet for the plant exclusive or vegan participants in this study. But what the study has found is that generally the vegetarians and particularly the vegans are the leanest of all dietary categories, that the vegans had about 40% fewer cataracts, the vegetarians about 30% fewer than similar health-conscious meat eaters. They had less heart disease, around 30% less, depending on which of their studies you look at. They had about the vegans had about 19% less cancer, lacto-ovo-vegetarians not quite so much. And then they also had less diabetes. This is a new study from 2019 following Epic Oxford. I think it was 43% lower diabetes. And no, I think it was 30. I just looked at it this morning for the first time. I didn't know it existed prior to that. So, but what was interesting is the pesco vegetarians actually had lower risk of diabetes in this particular study than the vegans, and that wasn't the case for heart disease. The pesco vegetarians weren't at any advantage over the non-vegetarians for heart disease. I could go on. Diverticular disease was 72% lower among the vegans. It was 27% lower among the lacto-ovo-vegetarians compared to similar health-conscious meat eaters. And so I think that this was an important study. It has, I think it's very similar to the Adventist Health Study too, which gives us a good indication of the potential advantage of plant-based diets compared to omnivorous diets.
I could tackle, I guess, the Adventist Health to climb on that, because the Epic Oxford did have some distinct differences with the Adventist Health, and it's been mentioned in several of the review studies because they did have B12 deficiencies that caused homocysteine deficiencies that probably affected their heart disease. And you got to understand when they do, I mentioned some of this in my talk, but when they do these studies and you hear them say control for, one of the advantages of a plant-based diet is that we are leaner, as was mentioned, but they control for that. So in other words, there was a part of the EPIC study that showed that they had less colon cancer, but they controlled for weight, and then there wasn't a difference because weight's an independent factor. So you got to keep these things in mind. The interesting thing about the Adventist Health, so what was the question? Why in LA do people die at an earlier age than Loma Linda?
In the 1950s, why were there 10 times more people in Loma Linda, California who lived to over 100 than there were in Los Angeles?
Right, so this was where we first started understanding about the Adventist Health group, or the Adventists in general, or Adventists in general, as it's supposed to be said. At that time, that study was all about smoking. They noticed that the Adventists, any Adventists out there? None? Oh, we got a few, there we go. Oh, yeah, hey. Well, don't let me tell you what your religion says, but the general idea is that your body's the temple of the soul, right? And so that you should treat it appropriately. It's a vessel of God, and therefore you don't smoke. And so the original Adventist studies were a look at the difference between smoking and not smoking. But the interesting thing is they started saying, well, this is such a healthy group of people. What else could we learn from them? And that's where the Adventist 1 and then Adventist 2 health studies came, where they actually did prospective studies of these people. It was a prospective registry where they then started doing studies, looking at the data. And then they started separating people between light meat eaters versus vegetarian versus pescatarian versus vegan, and once again, similar to the EPIC, but even stronger, there was an advantage to plant-based diets, which may be another reason it wasn't just the smoking, it was also the plant-based diets that made them live longer.
Okay, my question is to address the finding that over an 18-year period, people who ate the most animal protein had a 75% increase in total mortality, so that's death from any cause, which would include driving into a telephone pole while texting, and a fourfold increase in cancer. So what can we conclude from that? Well, let me approach this question from a different direction. If I put up a picture of a cow, a horse, and an elephant and ask you what's their natural diet, you would all say plants. Then I would ask you what time in their life do they eat animal protein? Some of you would say never. Others of you, after thinking a bit, would say, oh, when they're babies, when they're nursing. And that's the point. For plant-based species, animal protein is a growth stimulant and a growth signal. It turns on a suite of growth genes called TOR genes that actively tell your cells to try and grow and multiply and enlarge. That's wonderful if you're a baby. If you're an adult, it's a terrible thing because your cells should be quiet. They shouldn't be trying to grow. And so what ends up happening is they turn into tumors over time, hence the increase in cancer. But it also causes metabolic dysregulation, which can ultimately result in higher levels of inflammation, which will lead to heart disease, diabetes, and a host of other problems, and actually make you stupid enough to text while driving. So the bottom line is, and the other points about this is that if you're eating a lot of animal flesh, it's displacing healthier things from your diet, such as fruits, vegetables, grain, whole grains, and also fiber. And why is fiber important? Because we now understand with the gut-brain connection that a healthy microbiome is critically important to having a healthy mind and to lowering your risk of depression, anxiety, and a host of other problems. So the sum total is that if you have an animal food-based diet, you're gonna die. And you're gonna die, I mean, we're all gonna die, but you're gonna die sooner. And you might die in a lot of pain from an avoidable cancer.
Okay, my question had to do with the egg studies after 1990. And basically, the first thing I'll say is the agricultural groups in our country are very wealthy, and they have great business partners at the federal government. And that's part of our problem in this country. We don't have regulators and companies and industries that are regulated. We have business partners who join forces with agriculture and drug companies and that sort of thing to do their bidding, essentially. So anyway, to get to the point, the federal government every once in a while assesses what it's investing research dollars in. And two issues that have pretty much been decided at one point in time are smoking. I mean, we pretty much know smoking's not good for you, and spending a lot more federal dollars in researching it is useless because I don't think we're going to come up with some study that says it's great, right? And the other one was cholesterol, that there's a direct relationship between dietary cholesterol, plasma cholesterol, direct relationship between plasma cholesterol levels and cardiovascular disease and coronary artery disease. So the Fed stopped investing money in research, and that gave the Egg Board a very good opportunity to take advantage of that gap. So they started funding research. And study design is really important, and it's something that you have to look at because you can design a study to show almost anything you want it to show if you do it right. And so what some of the egg studies did was they took people who were eating already a high cholesterol diet. And there's such a thing as cholesterol saturation, where added cholesterol in the diet's not going to so much increase your plasma cholesterol anymore. And then they added eggs to these people's diet, and lo and behold, their cholesterol didn't go up. And they reported that eating eggs didn't increase your plasma cholesterol. Well, then what they did is a meta-analysis of studies, and they used the cutoff point the year that they started funding studies. So the inclusion criteria guaranteed that the meta-analyses would show that you could safely eat eggs, lots of them actually, and you wouldn't have to worry about plasma cholesterol. And so that's just one of the ways in which agricultural groups misbehave in terms of twisting the evidence to make people think that foods that aren't safe actually are safe to eat just in almost unlimited quantity if you choose to.
Okay, I'd like to ask another set of 6 questions for each of you to answer one, and to please try to make it a 3-minute answer. Question number 1. Tell us the information that was published in 1959 showing that if you grew up in Japan, you have a cholesterol of 120 and you almost never see a heart attack. If you move to Hawaii, your cholesterol rises to 180 and your heart attack risk triples. And then you move to Los Angeles, your cholesterol is now 210 and you have 10 times the heart attack risk than you had when you lived in Japan. That's question number 1. Question number 2. Tell us about the 2014 study by Harvard researcher Morgan Levine, where she looked at 6,000 people prospectively, where she concluded that if you're an animal protein eater, you would... Is this the same exact question I asked?
Same.
Okay, sorry, let's skip that. Okay, question 2. In the year 2000, the World Health Organization, after looking at 800 papers with 22 world experts, reported an 18% increase in cancer risk from eating processed red meat. Please tell us more about this. Number 3. It was mentioned that the Journal of the American College of Nutrition said intake of fish was correlated positively with the increased risk of diabetes. Please tell us more about this. Question 4. How did Finland in the 1970s go from having the highest heart attack rate in the world to dramatically lower? Question 5. Tell us more how Dean Ornish showed increased telomeres activity after only 3 months on a plant-based diet, and why does telomere activity matter? And question 6, is there a reason why we have to be 100% plant-based? So those are the 6 questions, if everyone would answer theirs in 3 minutes.
Okay.
I'll take the last one. Well, and then you're going to have something to say. I know. And we might just have to agree to disagree, and we're still going to be friends, I promise. Okay. So the question of 100% plant-based, we talked a little bit about this type of issue last night. And I appreciated Dr. Katz's comments on this, that if you look at the blue zones, you have some Adventists in the blue zones who are vegan, but there are also Adventists who are pescatarians and vegetarian, and so not all of them are vegan. And then if you look at where the other blue zones are, they almost all eat some animal food, and some a little bit more than you might imagine. And so what I'm taking away from this is not that I think animal food is required in the diet. That's not the point that I want to make at all. What I am saying is that veganism is not required. And I think that when we draw a line in the sand and say, look, the price of admission to our club where we eat well is that you have to make this extreme change, which a lot of what we do seems very extreme to other people. What I do doesn't seem extreme to me, but it's not about me. It's about the uninitiated person sitting in Des Moines, Iowa right now, watching this on the feed, who's saying, I want to improve my diet, I want to improve my health, but I have to deal with the practicality of what I'm willing to do. And we have very good research right now about the science of change that shows that there are 2 criteria that people consider when they're getting ready to make a change of any type. And this includes diet and, if you swear at work and all kinds of things that people try to change. One is that they have to think that it's going to benefit them. And the second thing is they have to see themselves doing it. And so we have never drawn that line in the sand. First of all, because we think it's a bit scientifically disingenuous for the general population to say if you don't do this, there's no hope for you to be healthy. I don't think that that's true. And second of all, because we have to be very careful that we don't win the battle and lose the war. One last thing I'll say about this, and I know we're trying to keep these to limited time. One of the things about my company that is a little bit different than some of the other practices that you might hear about, we're a membership organization, and some of our people have been members for 25 years. This is our 25th year in business. And so we get a chance to see what happens to people over a very, very long period of time. And one of the things that we look at, of course, is health change. I mean, if you used to have migraines and you don't have them anymore, we're pretty excited about that, right? But the other thing that we look for is compliance. In other words, what kind of journey has this been for you? Did you do this for 2 weeks and quit and then resurface 6 months later and start again? And we have some people who do that. Or did you do this and maybe it wasn't perfect, but you sustained it over a very long period of time and gotten better incrementally over time? A lot of our people do that, and they even become accidental vegans. And so all in all, looking at our data for over 100,000 people in 33 countries, we think that this, let's not draw lines in the sand and make this harder than it needs to be. Let's do the level of restriction it takes to get people on the path to health, and then hopefully keep them engaged to the place where they may do more later. But I have heart attack patients who aren't vegan, who've gone 19, 20 years without an event. They're not back on their cholesterol meds. Their blood pressure is normal. And I'll take less than perfect for a long time of that rather than the cycling in and out that I see people doing all the time.
Okay, I'm going to address that same question, and I'm going to start off by saying that I agree with you 100%, that we have to meet people where they are. Because we all learned in chemistry that the likelihood that a reaction will go forward depends on how low you get the activation energy. And if you make people think they got too high a mountain to climb, they're not going to do it. But that's a really separate question from, is there benefit to excluding all animal foods from the diet? And the problem I have with the way a lot of researchers address and approach this question is they will make what I consider to be a disingenuous statement by saying, well, we don't have any evidence that being 100% vegan is better than being mostly vegan. And they're right. We don't have that evidence because nobody's done the studies yet. But that doesn't mean that it's not true. And we've got to be careful because nobody's ever done a placebo-controlled, double-blind study to prove that mothers love their children, but we know they do. Okay, so, a study is not the answer for everything necessarily. To answer this question of whether or not a strictly healthy, whole food, plant-based diet is ultimately better than a mostly whole food, plant-based diet with a little bit of animal food is going to take 20, maybe 30 or 40 years. And I'm not sure if anybody's actually doing that study yet, but it definitely needs to be done. But we don't have to wait for the study to make some inferences because we have enough scientific principles and enough evidence that point us in the right direction. The study he just asked about, the 18-year study looking at those who ate the most animal food died. They crapped out. They had more cancer. What does that tell you? Is animal food good for you? No, it's not. It's like jumping off a building. If we did a study, had 100 people jump off a 10-story building, all of them would die. If we had 100 people jump off a 2-story building, 98 of them would survive. So do we conclude that jumping off buildings is not bad for you? No, it's just you don't get as much damage at jumping from 2 stories as you do from 10, but you still get damage. And that's what the evidence, in my opinion, shows us about animal foods. It turns on genes that cause cancer. It increases inflammation in the body. Animal protein residues in the colon are basically rotted by the microbiome to release toxins that, when absorbed into the bloodstream, go alter blood-brain barrier chemistry, make you more prone to depression, anxiety, and they actually interfere with the action of oligodendrocytes and can alter brain chemistry. So, yeah, we may not have definitive proof, but we got enough evidence pointing in the right direction that I can say to someone, my recommendation is that you do all plant-based, but I don't have that proof yet, but that's where the evidence is pointing.
I'll take the WHO with the cancer and the thing you hear about a lot with processed meat being a class 1 carcinogen, meaning it almost certainly is a carcinogen, and red meat being a 2A based on 800 studies that they looked at. And this has been a very interesting thing. It's been hotly debated, and it gets a little bit into what Milton was saying, because a lot of the criticism of the World Health Organization's findings were that a lot of these studies were what people say is correlation and not causation, because they're epidemiology studies. And in epidemiology, you are looking at a group of people over a long period of time and looking at their diet habits, and yes, there are all kinds of other factors. Now, in research, people don't seem to understand this. We have statistical methods to try to control for these things. So it's called multivariate regression analysis. We take a big group, like this whole group here, and we're gonna look at cancer, but if you're smoking, that's an independent cause of cancer, so all of you that smoke, you get left out of that study, that equation. And so, as Dr. Mills was saying, we're never going to have a prospective randomized controlled trial where we randomize someone to red meat or no red meat and follow them for 20 years to see whether or not they get cancer. It's just not going to be done. It would be impossible to be done. So we do have to understand there were no randomized controlled trials that showed us that smoking is bad for us. That was all based on epidemiology and correlation. You can't just have one study of correlation, but you start getting many, and the World Health Organization looked at over 800. And you start seeing this correlation over and over again, and you have mechanistic studies. In other words, we know that red meat and processed meat increase IGF-1, and we know that's a risk factor for getting cancer. We know that when you cook meat, you get heterocyclic amines, and that is a risk for cancer. We know that there is advanced glycated end products when you cook meat, and that's a risk factor for cancer. We know that new 5-GC that's present in meat and that gets incorporated into our cells could possibly increase cancer. There's a lot of possibilities and coulds, but it all comes together into a recommendation from a group of absolute experts on this topic, more expert than we are sitting up on this panel, that came to the conclusion after a lot of research, and these aren't vegans, that said that red meat and processed meat could definitely increase cancer.
All right, we'll just keep this moving down the line here. So the 1959 study was not Japan, Honolulu, and Los Angeles as advertised. It was Japan, Honolulu, and San Francisco. It was the Niho-san study. And this was a migration study, one of the early epidemiologic landmark studies that attempted to unbundle the influence of genes versus lifestyle. The one thing that makes this both interesting and complicated is that this wasn't just a change in lifestyle, this was a change in culture. And so there were a lot of variables in flux. And one of the things we like to do in science is compress the number of variables that are in motion at one time so we can extract from studies attribution. What was responsible for causing the results that we saw? So when you do a migration study, lots of things are changing, but essentially the takeaway message from altitude was Japanese people living in Japan, traditional Japanese diets, traditional Japanese lifestyle, very low rates of obesity, heart disease, almost all cancers, not quite all cancers. There's actually a relatively high rate of gastric cancer in Japan, but certainly overall cancer much lower than the US, overall better health. With a move to Honolulu, and that was just the migration pattern, so a lot of people who were on their way to the mainland US parked for a while in Honolulu, the diet, the lifestyle, the culture were somewhat intermediate, somewhat hybridized between a Japanese influence and a US influence. Rates of chronic disease, all this bad stuff that is so routine here in America, wound up being intermediate between the homeland in Japan and mainland US. And then the migration pattern completed itself, and these groups came over to San Francisco in particular, hence the name of the study, where rates of chronic disease approximated those of all the rest of us living here. So the particular value of the Niho-san study was to say the Japanese are not defended against American diseases by being Japanese. It's not Japanese genes that are protecting them, because the people that wound up in mainland America had the same genes that they started with, but they had our diet, they had our lifestyle, and they wound up with all of our diseases.
I'll dovetail onto that with Ornish's studies, and certainly I guess one of the sayings you may have heard before is our genes determine, may affect our risk of disease maybe 5%. The rest is determined by diet and lifestyle, so it's really diet and lifestyle. The genes may load the gun, but diet and lifestyle pull the trigger. And Ornish's studies, you're very familiar with Dean Ornish's studies on the lifestyle heart trial in 1990 and heart disease reversal. But he also did a series of studies beginning in 2005, another in 2008, and carried them on looking at men with prostate cancer and what would happen if they were provided with a similar kind of diet and lifestyle he used in the lifestyle heart trial. And one of the first things that was reported is that that basically genes could be turned on or off by changing your lifestyle. So your genes are not your destiny, if you will, but that the way you live could turn on cancer preventative type genes and turn off cancer promoting genes. And this was quite a revelation, I would say, at the time. And he went on to show that you could also affect the length of these little things at the ends of our chromosomes called telomeres, which essentially predict our longevity. And of course, as we age, one would expect the length of these telomeres would get a little shorter. And in fact, what happened when these folks were put on this diet and lifestyle program is they actually got slightly longer. So you could actually, again, change your destiny by changing your lifestyle. I think these studies were very important, and they opened a lot of doors for scientists in terms of looking at health and disease a little differently.
I want to give a shout out to David Katz. I was in Honolulu 2 weeks ago lecturing for the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, and I spoke about the Neo-San study, and I thought it was a Japanese word that meant great sushi. And I realize now it's Honolulu, San Francisco, and I thought it was Hiroshima, but Nagasaki. You know everything, and I sit at the feet of David Katz. Anyways, I will happily tackle Finland. You heard, if you were at Dr. Willett's talk, he mentioned the venerable name of Ansel Keys, Ph.D., because they had two of them, and studies he did called the 7-Country Study, and that launched in 1958. One of the sites picked to compare dietary patterns versus other societies like Okinawa, like Crete, like some American communities, was East Finland, called North Karelia. East Finland and North Karelia, it's confusing, but it was known to be a pocket of potential heart disease and a very high fat diet, specifically as they evolved the study, high saturated fat diet. And it turned out by the late 60s, about 10 years after the 7-Country Study was launched, that it was pretty clear that the highest heart attack rate in the Western world was in East Finland, a budding Russia. And their diet was very heavy in sausage and very heavy in butter, and had a saturated fat rate that approached 30% of calories were from saturated fat. To the point that 40, 45, 50-year-old men were having heart attacks at a rate unprecedented. And when men have heart attacks, they often just drop dead. It's a special thing we do better than women. Many gifts we have to end up dying earlier than women. So there was this massive public health study. They found this guy with the cutest name of Puka Peska, an MD in the public health sector, young man who took on the onus of going to food companies. Can we sneak beans in the sausage? Let the women know. God forbid, don't tell the men when they go out in the fields. Can we, change the butter to margarine on the store shelves? They did recommend quitting smoking. That sometimes gets brought up as a criticism. It wasn't just the food. It was a comprehensive lifestyle change. And within 5 years, the heart attack rate had dropped 80 to 85%. Well, if you live in West Finland, you say, I want to be part of it. So they extended the study to the entire country. And they ultimately showed, and it continues to this day, major and significant reductions in heart attack rates. But it's extended to overall lifespan and certainly cancer cases too, not 80 to 85%, but cancer is somewhere in the 50% or so range. So, many of us point to it as one of the most instructive of public health measures by changing diet to really change measurable and important lifestyle measures. There's this beautiful graph of just drop in heart attack rates over 5 years. So North Karelia.
It's not working.
David, perhaps the annals of internal medicine has
sabotaged
got
my
your
microphone.
button?
I don't know. So great answer by Joel. Just to append something. So the North Karelia study is currently run by Puka Peska's successor, Erkki Vartiainen, and we were privileged. I met Erkki in Lithuania. We were privileged to actually have him come over and speak at the American College of Lifestyle Medicine meeting. So the story is beautiful, and it lasts a very long time. Over a span of almost half a century, rates of heart disease in North Karelia dropped 82%. Average life expectancy went up a full decade. One of the more stunning examples of community-wide effective public health intervention in the world. But, alas, this age of alternative truth, social media echo chambers, misinformation, and the well-funded machinations of the beef industry have caused the Finnish to begin doubting all the things that Americans are doubting. So, maybe meat is really better for me, right? Big fat surprise and all of that. So Erkki reported that actually after all those many years of stunning and luminous benefit from their intervention, that young Finns were starting to increase their intake of meat and their intake of saturated fat. And for the first time in half a century, they saw the mortality curve going back up. We have to be very careful never to take for granted the gains that we've achieved because, famously, familiarity breeds contempt. We're seeing that, by the way. I don't know how this audience is going to feel about this comment. I will take my chances just the same. It's clearly off topic, but we're seeing that with vaccines. Vaccines are one of the more stunning advances in all of public health history. And yet, when you get comfortable with the fact that you don't have to worry that your kids are going to get poliomyelitis every spring when nobody gets smallpox, you start to worry more about vaccines than the dreaded diseases that vaccines prevent until you get a new dread disease like the coronavirus, and then everybody's wondering when there'll be a vaccine. But we tend to do that. We get complacent about our gains, and then we start to shift our perspective until we're imperiled again. So sadly, some of those gains in North Korea are imperiled.
Can I ask you? I was at that lecture where they talked. I was interested in, and maybe you could comment, or one of you to comment. They were so. It seemed like they thought that the margarine shift was the biggest part of that. I was very impressed at the ACLM meeting that they were all into how the margarines seemed to shift. And the other thing I wanted in this change that I knew was happening, they seemed to say that there was an abutting area in Finland that was eating mainly meat and doing better than North Korea. That's how it started. Do you know if there's any truth to that?
So I just have the benefit, Joel, of having been at the lecture. So as Joel mentioned, they did a lot of things, Garth. So they focused on reducing smoking. They focused on reducing sodium intake. They focused on reducing saturated fat. And then much of the replacement was with polyunsaturated fat from plant sources. Honestly, I think if they had reduced saturated fat with any healthy alternative, they would have witnessed much the same benefit. But I think Erkki and others were kind of subscribed to the Mediterranean diet notion. So, I think Ansel Keys also, Ansel Keys, by the way, everybody associates his name with a low-fat diet. He practiced a Mediterranean diet. He advocated for a Mediterranean diet. He really was focused on reducing saturated fat. So,
and way outlived all of his critics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But Pukka-Pekka and Erkki Vartiainen were sort of disciples of Ansel Keys, so I think they may have had an early focus, Joel, maybe you can speak more to this, on benefits of replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat. That was the purpose of the margarine, and obviously this was not trans fat containing margarine.
Right, I remember them saying that, but they were very proud of their margarine.
But they did achieve multiple changes in lifestyle. Yeah. I think, I agree with Joel, I think that's a good thing. At the end of that, you're not able to say, okay, how much exactly of this benefit was related to salt versus saturated fat versus tobacco.
Yeah.
But, they sort of lined up all the bad stuff, knocked it all down, and added 10 years to life expectancy. You sort of say after that, who cares?
Who cares, right?
Yeah. It was all healthy bad, lifestyle. They fixed it all.
Okay, I'd like to ask another set of questions and try to answer each one in 3 minutes. Okay, first question. How much protein do we need? For growing children, what should they eat to make sure they get enough protein? Is there a way that we could not get enough protein? Are you positive that kids and adults don't need animal products to get enough protein? It's a funny thing. I am definitely brainwashed. In other words, I'm 100% plant-based, and I'm still every now and then, if someone says it loud enough, I think, I don't know, that's what I was told when I was little, and it's been answered 100 times, but it still sometimes seems like something I'm not confident in. Number 2, do you recommend cholesterol-lowering drugs in any cases? Why or why not? Question 3, how does human anatomy compare with those animals that are designed to eat other animals, like a lion, versus those that are designed to eat plants, like an elephant? Question 4. Thomas Seyfried, professor at Boston College, spoke last year at the Real Truth About Health conference. He said that glucose and glutamine were the foods of cancer. So does that mean we should avoid all glucose? And how would we even avoid glutamine if we wanted to? Question 5. A lot of what you're saying about weight loss, about obesity, diabetes, heart disease seems to make sense. But what about dementia? Will lifestyle prevent Alzheimer's the way it prevents heart disease? And question 6 is, what is candida? And how do you get rid of it? So the questions again, the first one was getting enough protein. The second was cholesterol-lowering drugs. The third was, how does human anatomy compare with those animals that are designed to eat other animals? Fourth was Thomas Seyfried saying the foods of cancer are glucose and glutamine. Question 5 was, how do you prevent dementia? And question 6 is, what is candida and how do you get rid of it?
I'll go first and I'll talk about Dr. Seyfried's lecture and his work. And I have written a lot about this. I invited Dr. Seyfried to speak for the first time at one of our conferences about, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, and Dr. Campbell was the speaker also. And as soon as I announced it, I get a lot of hate mail and nasty comments, and some of it's amusing, some of it not so much, but people are like, I can't believe you invited Dr. Seyfried to come and speak with Dr. Campbell, and how can you put these two people together, and they're diametrically opposed and they don't have the same ideas, and are you going to become a paleo person? I mean, it was just absolutely insane. Like, I got close to 1,000 emails like this. Well, the first thing that I'll tell you is that the Saturday night of our conference, Dr. Seyfried and Dr. Campbell were in my hospitality suite till 2:30 in the morning talking. It's one of the most interesting conversations I've ever heard. They're not as diametrically opposed as you might imagine. And I went home that night and I thought, if I die in my sleep tonight, this is the way I'd like to spend the last few hours of my life. It's very interesting. But Dr. Seyfried's work is based on Otto Warburg's research in the 1940s. He was a Jewish researcher in Germany. And the reason why he didn't end up in the camps is because Hitler had a polyp on his vocal cord, and he thought he might need some cancer researchers sometime, so he never sent the Jewish cancer researchers, some of them, to the camps. So anyway, he toiled away in Nazi Germany and made a discovery that all cancer cells were the same regardless of where they were located in the body, and that they all took up glucose at a more rapid rate. They didn't respire normally. So speed ahead, and a guy by the name of Peterson picked up Warburg's work at Hopkins, and then Seyfried picked it up, and he wrote a very interesting textbook called Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. And one of the things that he talks about in the book is the potential for managing cancer, some types of cancer, the way that you manage type 1 diabetes. You die with it, not of it. Handled properly, you could live till the end of your life. And he's focused on people who have forms of cancer that people don't have long enough to live to use alternative approaches or integrative approaches or just diet to try to resolve. So if you have slow developing chronic lymphocytic leukemia, you can often eat your way out of it. We have a lot of people who have. But if you have glioblastoma, you're likely to be dead in 8 months, and there's just not enough time to do much, and the treatments don't work. You're going to be dead in 8 months whether you get the treatments or not. And he's been successful in using a ketogenic diet with some of these people who have literally death sentences. And one of his patients, he reported on a case report when he was in Columbus about a patient who lived for 7.5 years after her diagnosis of glioblastoma, that just doesn't happen. He's got quite a few like that now. And he set up an institute to work with doctors who want to learn how to do this. So I think the point is that we have to make sure that we're looking at the application of diet to cancer without such a one-size-fits-all lens. I talked about that last night. I think it's important that we not do what medicine has done, which is try to slot everybody into this. If you have this, this is what we do for all cancer patients. This is what we do for all heart patients. So when I'm dealing with somebody who has terminal cancer, like treatments don't work, you don't have very long to live, I think that Seyfried's approach is a reasonable approach. When you've got somebody who has stage 2 breast cancer, I think that would be insane okay? So I think that there's a lot more I could say about it, and I could probably talk to you for 3 or 4 hours, but Steve would have tranquilizer darts to keep that from happening. So we'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of legitimacy to using certain strategies that deprive cancer cells of glucose for very long periods of time, and that is not diametrically opposed to the way that we would approach a person with cancer that is far less aggressive at a much earlier stage, and et cetera.
I totally agree with your approach, and we have to look at different things, but I think SafeFree has 2 patients that have been successful, no more than 2. I think he's got an N of 2, which to me is not science. I attended you guys have seen me do this before. I attended a lecture of his where I just was like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Because it was such speculation and anecdote on 2 people. Most of it was rat studies. It's based on this idea that cancer cells, first of all, you can't extrapolate treatment of cancer to prevention of cancer. Those are 2 different things.
Right.
Secondly, he's done nothing to prove the effectiveness of his treatment except provide 2 anecdotal reports. So what I see a lot of times in researchers, I think we all see it, is where they lose the forest for the trees. Definitely cancer cells depend on cancer. He may be right, but I'd like to see a little bit more evidence before it's taken by the vast public to say, oh my God, sugar is the cause of cancer, because that's not true.
Well, I have to respond to that, okay?
Yeah.
I've listened to his lectures for a long time. He was at our conference last year also. And he spent about 90 seconds of the 2 hours he talked on those 2 patients. So there's a lot more to this than that.
Yeah.
His textbook is 400 pages with 3,000 references, and I think that before we get into the weeds about it, people should read that book, all right? It's tough to read. It's really
It's
technical.
very in the weeds.
It is in the weeds, but
Yeah.
the point that he's making, I think that we have to step back and look at the point that he's making. He actually talks about plant-based diets in that
He
book.
did, and in the conference I went to, I started asking these things because I said, well, come on, IGF-1 stimulates cancer. Yeah, oh, yes, it definitely does.
Right.
But you're telling people to eat meat. No,
No,
I'm not telling
he's not.
people to eat
He's
meat.
not.
Yeah,
No,
I
he's
think it
not.
gets lost in the message,
Well,
though.
But
yeah.
the other thing, too, is that in the United States, he is working on doing a study, but in the United States, an IRB is never going to approve a study that randomizes glioblastoma patients to a keto diet versus radiation, which will kill them. So everybody who's making interesting discoveries, we have Dr. Koh coming to our conference this fall. She's another one who's been ostracized by the cancer community. If you have an interesting idea about cancer that has some promise, you're never going to get a chance to try it in this country. So the only thing that you can do, look at what Esselstyn did. He never could have gotten his study approved either. So he basically said, listen, if you show up and say you want me to help you with diet and cardiovascular disease, I'd like to be able to use your data. Okay with you? All right, great. So we don't have to randomize. And of course, he gets beat up all the time because there's no control group either. Well, the control group is what happens to people who don't do this. And in the case of glioblastoma, they're all dead. If anybody lives, it's an anomaly, right? So what he's basically doing is training doctors around the world to do this, where there's a lot more freedom to practice differently, and also making the information available, hoping that enough people on their own might do it, and then submit their case reports to join the others. And that's the only way he'll ever be able to prove it. But the basic premise of what Seafried is talking about is that all cancer cells are the same. They respire abnormally, and if you treat that, and there are different ways of treating it, including fasting. He talks about fasting.
I mean, fasting for
Intermittent fasting to potentiate chemotherapy. We've used that with a lot of people with great results. A keto diet for somebody who's 8 months from death. Various ways to address the metabolic abnormality of cancer cells. So I agree with you that there are limitations to his work, but they're not self-imposed.
I just want people to understand that there's a difference between hypothesis and theory. Those are 2 different things.
Well, I understand
Hypothesis
that,
is
but if you're the
anecdote,
person with glioblastoma, you don't really care much about that. You're just looking for something that might help you, because nobody in oncology's got any ideas for you at this point.
Yeah, but the problem I have with Seafried is not that. It's not the glioblastoma patient. It's the extrapolation of his work to this whole support of ketosis diet and some kind of idea that ketosis prevents cancer, which it does not
doesn't.
do. Yeah, and so that's what really bothers me. And besides, if you really want to look at evidence-based research for a nutrient fueling cancer, there's much more evidence for methionine fueling cancer than there is sugar. Very good studies, prospective, randomized trials in conjunction with chemotherapy, but very strong evidence that methionine, which is very heavy in animal products.
Right, and remember that the keto people are grasping for anything that they can, including the
right.
misinterpretation of
Including
other
the
people's work.
misinterpretation,
All right,
right.
they misinterpret Campbell's work.
Right. We could talk about it and say, oh, yeah, this is interesting. They misinterpret that and take it as ketosis prevents cancer.
Right.
That's fun. Yeah.
I was going to say, it's been a long time since I watched Saturday Night Live and that kind of back and forth on the news. Jane Curtin and such.
I was starting to think the same. That was good. Good discussion. Well, let's shift to something less controversial. People are not lions, and people are not horses either. So I was in the Game Changers and corresponded significantly with the directors and producers. And, you know, overall it was very good. Documentaries, though, are about making a point. And when you're making a point, particularly when you're trying to rectify a misperception, and in the case of the Game Changers, the misperception is if you want to be a badass, you've got to eat meat. If you want to be big and strong, you've got to eat meat. If you want to be a supreme athlete, you have to be omnivorous. That's false. You can fuel the supremes of human performance on a plant-exclusive diet. So I think the movie made that point very effectively. But when you're making a point, sometimes there is a tendency to tell just part of a full story because that part better makes your point. So, any of you see it? Game Changers? So, you know, there's this segment in the middle where they're talking about anatomy and they compare the human anatomy to a lion and the lion's GI tract is shorter and all of that. And okay, we're not lions. That's true. Lions are obligate carnivores, we are not. What they didn't do was continue the comparison and say, okay, here's an obligate herbivore like a horse, and we're not that either. I have a horse. My horse horses colic periodically. You know, they have very vulnerable GI tracts. My horse did some years ago. Wound up having surgery, and they extracted 15 feet of his intestine. And I was warned by lots of people in the horsey world that he would never recover fully. He did. They just need to be given the opportunity. He's perfect. But that's my point. He lost 15 feet of intestine, and neither of us can tell. That doesn't tend to happen with people. You lose 15 feet of your intestine, it makes a hell of a big difference. So we're not horses either. We're in the middle. We are clearly anatomically, physiologically omnivores, and I don't think anybody should be reluctant or ashamed. You know what that means? It means we've got choices. And then it's up to us to make good choices. And as we've been discussing extensively, the good reasons to choose plant-based diets include not just our own health, but kinder, gentler treatment of our fellow creatures and good stewardship of the planet. Make good choices.
Okay, Alex, I want to present the alternative view on that. There are profound differences between, of course, strict carnivores like lions and the type of herbivores that horses are and the type that humans are. But the remarkable thing is that if you look at the human GI tract and compare it to that of a horse, they look remarkably similar. And what's really interesting and really important is to understand that animals that are designed to subsist on a diet of other animals have to have a specific suite of anatomical adaptations that make that possible. Number one, hunting is inherently inefficient. Even the best designed predators on the planet will only make a kill in the wild on an average of 7 to 10 days. That means a study that was done in the Isle of National Royale National Park in Canada showed that one of the largest wolf packs were unsuccessful 95% of the time they went out to hunt. That meant that 95% of the time they tried to get a meal, they didn't get it. So the question is, what in God's name could allow an animal to miss 95% of its meals and still survive as a species? How can these predators eat once every 7 to 10 days and still not only live, but have enough energy to reproduce and raise their kids and then, you know, make it till they can have another meal? Well, one of the biggest things is that they have giant stomachs. They have stomachs that allow them to eat 30% of their body weight at a single meal. That would mean that a person who weighs 150 pounds could eat 45 pounds of food at a single meal. Nobody can do that. the fact is that from elephants down through rabbits, all herbivores actually eat about 3.3% of their body weight every day. That actually includes humans. If you weigh the amount of food a human eats over the course of the day, it will come out to be roughly 3.3% of the body weight, depending on whether or not they're overeating and blowing up to the size of a Michelin man. So, but this is important because it has implications for not only our physiology, but also, and this is where we've really dropped the ball, on the kind of research we should be doing in trying to understand human disease. We're told that we're omnivores. Everybody's been told that. That's a lie, because the true omnivores in nature not only have anatomical adaptations to both procure and consume animal food and plant foods, they also have physiologic adaptations. So, for instance, you look at a bear. A bear can literally not eat for 6 months, come out of the den, find a rotting deer carcass, eat, 30% of its body weight of that a deer carcass, and be perfectly fine. Do you know what happened to concentration camp victims when these camps were liberated by Allied soldiers and these starving people were given food? Many of them died because when they were given this massive concentrated load of very osmotically active food, it caused a massive shift of fluid from their already depleted bodies into their digestive tract. They got diarrhea, went into circulatory collapse, and died. That's why when you go into the hospital, if you have bowel surgery and you stop eating, the surgeons insist that you start to refeed yourself in a stepwise fashion, because herbivores have a trophic digestive tract, meaning your gut cells only mature if they're constantly exposed to food. If you stop eating, they stop maturing. If they stop maturing, they lose the ability to hold water and prevent water from translocating from your circulatory system into your digestive tract. They lose their ability to do that whole absorptive thing that they do, and I'm kind of sort of shortening it. It's a little more complicated than that. But the differences between carnivores and herbivores actually even comes down to a subcellular level. And what I mean by that, there is a suite of enzymes in mammalian evolution that has been conserved throughout evolution. But where they're found within cells depends on the animal's diet. So in carnivores, these enzymes are found exclusively in the mitochondria, where they are used for gluconeogenesis. Well, why is that? Because carnivores don't eat a carbohydrate. So any carbohydrate they have, they've got to make. And their gluconeogenic enzymes are gluconeogenesis means making new glucose, are turned on 100% of the time, all day, every day. If you are a plant eater, you're eating plenty of starch and glucose, so you don't need to have full-time gluconeogenesis going on. But what you do need is you need the ability to detoxify plant alkaloids, because plants don't want to be eaten, and they load up their tissues with all of these compounds like caffeine and some other more sinister ones that when animals eat them can either make them sick or kill them. So if you are dependent on plants, you have to have the ability to detoxify these compounds. That's why you can't feed your pets like aspirin and other medicines or you can't give cats onions because it'll cause hemolytic anemia and things like that. They can't handle those compounds. And so in strict herbivores, these enzyme systems are found exclusively in cellular organelles called lysosomes. In by design omnivores like bears and raccoons that are designed to eat both plant and animal foods, you find, okay, I get it, half in the mitochondria, half in the lysosomes. Where are they found in humans? Exclusively in the lysosomes, as they are in all strict herbivores.
Mic drop. All right, I guess I'll take the protein question, since that's been kind of my area of interest. So how much protein do we need? Well, the RDA did a series of studies and reviews of these over many, many years, which I catalog in my book. They came up using nitrogen utilization studies, so you measure how much nitrogen you take in, how much nitrogen you put out, to kind of come up with an idea of how much nitrogen we need. And then you then build a normal curve. You know what a normal curve is, right? So some people needed a certain amount, other people's needed a certain amount. They wanted to make sure that people got, before they give a recommended daily allowance, they want to make sure that enough people got all the protein that they needed in order to get proper utilization and not get what's called catabolic, where you're breaking down protein. And so they recommended roughly 56 grams for an adult male, 46 for a female. Now you got to remember, that's 2 standard deviations above the normal, because they wanted to make sure they got everybody, or over 90% of the population. So probably we need less than that, less than those recommendations, but to be safe, those are not the minimum you need. That's the be safe, we got you covered, 56 grams for a male, 46 grams for a female. MIT kind of came out with a study saying that wasn't an effective way at looking at this, and they looked at something called muscle protein stimulation studies using radioactive labeled amino acids and that utilization. And that brought the number up a bit, though they never provided much study showing that we were deficient at those levels. In fact, people eat way more than that 56 grams for a male and 46 grams for a female. Depending on whether you look at the NHANES data or what you're looking at, it's 70 to 100, sometimes 120. Bodybuilders are going for 180 over that 56 grams. And the muscle protein studies are basically get us that formula usually here, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram lean body mass, not your weight, but what your lean fat-free mass is. People have now say 0.8 per pound or 0.8 per total weight, which is inaccurate. So people are way overeating both the RDA's recommendations and even the further studies. If you're exercising, yes, you need more. How much? Oh my God, there's about 10 million studies on this and a lot of argument. In the exercise physiology world, they're saying between 1.8 and 2.2 seems to be the same. There's no difference. There's some studies saying 1.6 grams per kilogram lean body mass. There's a lot at 1.2. I will tell you, if you're an Olympic athlete and you're trying to get that 0.5 seconds in order to get the gold, maybe you need slightly more. But when you look at the studies showing the increased protein, and not look at muscle protein synthesis, but rather look at actual muscle size or actual weight lifted, it makes such a minuscule difference that I don't know why you would take on the risk of higher protein for that tiny little minuscule difference. So typically, I go with, if you're an athlete, 1.2 grams per kilogram lean body mass, not your weight. If you're a regular person going about your day, walking normally, I like the RDA. And I think it works well. As far as can you get enough on a plant-based protein, is that enough? Obviously it's enough. There's very good studies on long-term vegans, as we've talked about, showing that they actually live longer. And unless you're getting, the only studies I've seen with protein deficiency have all been Kenyan studies and things like that, where you're living with people at subsistence, eating nothing but cereal, barely getting their protein, and if they do, they're getting it basically with low calories too. In my practice, and I don't know if anybody's seen, anybody suffering from low protein that wasn't low calories. Has anybody ever seen that before? I just haven't seen it, so. Oh, and as far as children are concerned, they can certainly do it too. The only thing I caution with children is you got to make sure the children are eating a varied diet. Protein is very important. You do need protein. It's so important. It happens to be in just about everything we eat. So you can get it with plants, but you got to make sure that they are getting the more plant concentrated proteins such as legumes. So if you got a kid who doesn't want to eat legumes at all and doesn't want to eat any nuts at all, well, you got a little bit of an issue where you do need to make sure they're getting enough protein. What's that? Yeah, you can't do that. Yeah, you're not going to bed until you eat your lentils. Yeah.
Hit the button.
I'll just continue on the protein conversation because I completely agree with everything you said, but I would simply add that I have seen a couple of instances where people aren't getting quite enough protein. And so one is in teenagers who often become very passionate about animal rights and the environment, which is a wonderful thing. But they kind of do a switch from eating burgers and fries and Coke to just eating the fries and Coke. And so they're eating an awful lot of sugar and an awful lot of fat. And on some occasions, I've seen some getting 20 to 30 grams of protein a day. And for a growing teenager, that's not enough. So they need to add in more concentrated protein sources, such as legumes and tofu and things like that, nuts and seeds and so forth. The second group, of course, we know about people not getting enough calories, like people with eating disorders. But the other group that may not get enough protein are people that are eating pretty much exclusively fruit. And some fruits have very low protein concentration. So on average, people probably need, around 10% of calories from protein, depending on the person. But many fruits are much lower than that. So it's possible in that situation, and I've seen it on a number of occasions, people doing a raw diet where it's mainly fruits, some vegetables, and a lot of oils. And in that case, they need to add more nuts and seeds. They may need to add some sprouted lentils and things like that.
Brenda,
So-
what was their phenotypic presentation? I mean, how are you diagnosing them with protein deficiency?
So what we often see in the raw food folks, I mean, in children, sometimes you just see them not
Right.
thriving as they should.
Right.
But in the other folks, we see hair loss, and this is really quite common in the raw world where people really start losing a lot of hair. Their nails aren't growing well, or they have problems with them. They have problems, skin problems. Their skin almost looks thin and weak. And so we have to remember that protein is, and we see bone loss. And I know that is a bit of a controversial subject, but of course, protein is necessary for building the matrix of bones. And so you can be too low. And in fact, there was an Adventist Health Study 2 study looking at 65,000 women that found that those eating a few legumes had a much higher rate of wrist fracture than those eating more legumes and getting more protein in their diet. So there is a sort of a level at which below you don't want to go too much below. And so working with raw food people, I have seen that. And when we add a little protein to the diet, they tend to overcome some of these issues.
I wanted, Joel, before you take on another question, 2 references to add to this protein discussion and 1 anecdote. One of the references is by Christopher Gardner at Stanford University. Really nice report, Advances in Nutrition, about a year ago, making perfectly clear that all plants contain all of the essential amino acids. That's just sort of been a myth in nutrition for a very long time. We followed that up working together with others and wrote a paper arguing for a modernization of the definition of protein quality, because we talk about the quality of protein independently of the quality of the food, and that misleads people. All right, so the idea that meat is high quality protein if you look at the concentration of amino acids, but if the meat is going to make you more prone to death and disease and not do you any favors, the food is not high quality. And if you can get all those same proteins, the levels you need from plants that are actually good for you and good for the planet and all of that, that's a higher quality source of protein. The anecdote, just very quickly, is last night before my panel, I wanted to get something to eat in the lobby, and they had a quinoa salad at this little atrium restaurant out here. I said, okay, well, that looks okay. And the server asked me, would you like protein with that? I said, actually,
That is my least favorite question in the world.
Quinoa is a pretty good source of protein, actually. And she said, really?
Yeah.
So the quinoa was the source of protein.
Gardner was pretty interesting. At ACLM, he went through his diet and he actually went and looked at it. Did he have any, because he was eating a plant-based diet, did he have any amino acid deficiencies? And he couldn't find that he had a single amino acid deficiency. But the meat-based industry is starting to jump on this terminology of protein quality. assuming that having higher leucine is therefore good for you. But we know that higher leucine increases IGF-1 and stimulates mTOR, which leads to possible cancer and aging. And so having more of a certain amino acid is not necessarily better.
David, you want cholesterol drugs or do you want dementia? You can take your topic, I don't care.
No, I don't. I took anatomy.
you took
you know, it's like
protein.
horses, lions. No.
Well, I'll take dementia because I'm speaking about cholesterol drugs tomorrow.
But do I want cholesterol drugs or dementia? No.
No.
But thank you for asking.
I wanted you to read into it what you wanted to read into it. Can you prevent dementia was basically the question. Yeah, and I'm not a neurologist, but one has to be familiar, well-read, and we are all concerned about our memory and where we left our car in the parking lot. There was a splash about 3-4 years ago, a scientist out of the Buck Institute in San Francisco, and then a book called The End of Alzheimer's that was embraced very quickly by the functional medicine community, of which I'm a member, but I don't agree eye to eye with all. The idea that there are 36 holes in the roof of your house if you're starting to lose your memory, that's the analogy, and you can plug each and every one of them, some with fitness, some with diet that favors a ketogenic diet in this approach, and a whole lot of supplements from huperzine to vinpocetine and on and on. It quickly became a franchise, and the author of the book profited quite nicely. He did publish a scientific paper, but it's not Alzheimer's. It's at best something called MCI, mild cognitive impairment, that may progress on, but may not progress on to the clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's. 9 of 10 patients showed some improvement. And then there was a business, and there hasn't been much follow-up publication. A number of my friends in the Detroit community did train in this kind of franchise of brain health. They basically have all abandoned it. It was very expensive for patients. It was very complex. And there really hasn't been a good foundation to show that it actually prevented Alzheimer's. On the other hand, within a few months out came the Schurzey's Alzheimer's Solution. You may have known that book. I think it's a wonderful book with the neuro program of nutrition and exercise and optimized mind-body and other features there, some mind games. But they certainly do not claim that they prevent dementia. In fact, most reasonable scientists don't believe at this point. We actually know that anybody can prevent it. There is an inherited risk called ApoE. I have a practice full of people who've inherited a rather adverse ApoE44 that 20 years earlier in life than on average, you may start to have some memory issues, and there seems to be an advantage to a low saturated fat diet, which is perhaps our community, and lower alcohol consumption. But these are trends. We don't really know that all for sure. The general trend is that a lot of cognitive impairment is cardiovascular impairment. It's microcirculation. It's vascular dementia. And certainly the theme out of the Chicago Healthy Aging Project and other is that optimal blood pressure, optimal blood sugar, optimal blood cholesterol, regular fitness, good sleep, avoidance of smoking, and I would say embracing a whole food diet, largely of plants, would be wise. But I think there's science to come before we say we, have certainly beat down Alzheimer's. I don't think anybody really claims that yet. I'll say, just tying in the question we didn't do, the general data is statins don't cause Alzheimer's. If anything, they're neutral and may have a slight advantage if your cholesterol is 300 and there's no other mechanism to bring it down. The latest meta-analysis are fairly, reassuring.
Okay, I'm going to ask 6 more questions. In this case, yes. Yes.
Joel, how much glucose dysregulation have you seen with statins? Because I've seen a fair amount in clinic.
Yeah. So there's, good question, and there is no direct understanding why there's been an observation. It may be a mitochondrial toxin is the common statement, whether simvastatin is the most glycemic of statins. It used to be called Zocor, and some of the others are more favorable, as mentioned, whether coenzyme Q10, at least in one lab study. protected the mitochondria, and this response has been mentioned, but there's very little data on it, actually. I mean, there's the databases that suggest if you're a healthy person and you're placed on a statin, the likelihood you're going to see a major shift in your insulin sensitivity and actually develop diabetes is very low. But if your hemoglobin A1C is 6.2 and your waistline is 43 inches and your diet is not optimal, it may push you a couple points up on measures and you will fulfill criteria of type 2 diabetes. Offset by what I'll talk about tomorrow, at least some data to suggest it prevents the #1 killer of men and women in high-risk subsets like previous heart attacks and post-bypass and such. In my own clinic, I'm concerned. I'm not an aggressive statin user, but they need to be pulled out now and then. And I have stopped people's statins, and you always can for a couple months repeat the hemoglobin A1C. It wanders down. I won't say it's, amazingly potent intervention to stop and reassess, but I will, and very often 3-4 times a week reintroduce it, and you get pretty adequate balance between cardiovascular risk reduction and not elevating the blood sugar. I think it's a real deal, though.
Okay, so I have more questions, and I guess for time's sake, if we could keep them to 2 minutes, that would be ideal. Okay, so the first question is, do plant-based eaters or vegans have to be especially careful to get enough vitamin D, DHA, EPA, iodine, taurine, vanadium, chromium, and omega-3s? Is there any risk in getting all of these from supplements as opposed to food? That's question 1. Question 2 is, Dr. Kahn, you've said I've been inside the heart 15,000 times and I've never scooped sugar out of a blocked artery. I scoop cholesterol out of blocked arteries. Please explain this. Question 3, what does the science say about fish consumption and health? Does fish raise our TMAO levels, and why does this matter? Does fish have mercury in it, and why does this matter? Question 4, are there any whole food plant-based foods we should avoid, such as potatoes, certain high oxalate green vegetables, nightshade vegetables, peanuts, cashews, which supposedly are not really raw because they have to be heated because that's how they get them. Brian Clement from Hippocrates says black beans are very hybridized and very hard to digest. People have been saying brown rice is grown in areas where there's high arsenic. So are there any whole food plant-based diets that are not on your list to say go ahead with? Question 5, how do you prevent and treat urinary tract infections? And question 6, it was said 21 international organizations, including the World Health Organization, American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, Institute of Medicine, all say eat as little saturated fat as possible. They couldn't be more clear, and these are highbrow organizations not associated with the vegan movement. 21 out of 21 groups say the same thing. Please explain this a little more. So one more time, first question was on the supplements, second was Dr. Kahn, third was on fish and TMAO, fourth was on whole food plant-based foods that we might want to avoid, fifth was urinary tract infections, and the sixth was the 21 out of 21 groups.
I'll go first, and I want to talk about the foods to avoid. The first thing is this issue of hybridization comes up a lot. And if you were to go to the grocery store and say, I would like for you to point me in the direction of the area of the produce section where the non-hybridized foods are, there are none. And this is a good thing for the most part. In fact, the reason why there was a potato famine that killed 1 million people in Ireland was because there was only one kind of potato that was grown there. And had they been hybridizing potatoes, and there were lots of varieties of potatoes, people would have just eaten the potatoes that weren't hit by the blight, all right? And so hybridization has been going on since the beginning of agriculture, and breeding plants together, like tomatoes with tomatoes and soybeans with soybeans, to come up with bigger tomatoes. Like my father, after he retired, got involved with the OSU horticulture department. He got a master's degree in horticulture. And they were breeding something that ended up being the mortgage lifter tomato. This guy invented it because he lost his job and he helped pay off his mortgage with these tomatoes. But anyway, they were designed to be like the size of a slice of bread, so that you'd have one slice of tomato that really held its form. And there's, yeah, it was cool. And there's nothing the matter with it. It tasted really great. So the first thing is, discarding a food because it's hybridized, you've got nothing left to eat. We need to hope that there are new hybridized foods coming out all the time that can meet the needs of the population around the world. The problem is people confuse this with genetic modification, and they're not the same thing. All right, that's not the same thing. I think the biggest, without going into all these individual foods, because Steve wants to keep us to 2 minutes, and we're doing such a good job following your directions. Have you noticed that? But the problem with the foods to avoid list is that this goes back to this one size fits all. I mean, people write books about gluten is bad. Well, you know what? If you have celiac disease, it's really bad, all right? And if you have certain types of autoimmune disease, it's probably good to stay away at least from high gluten foods. But not the rest of the world. If you go into anaphylactic shock when you're exposed to peanuts, you should not eat them, but I don't, and so there's no reason for me to not have peanut butter once in a while. So I think it's very important that we not try to come up with hit lists of plant foods that we're not supposed to eat, because most people can eat most of them without any problem at all. So first of all, if you have a food allergy, I mean, if you eat strawberries and your tongue swells up and you can't swallow, do not eat them, all right? But that's not an indictment of strawberries, and everybody should stay away from them. So in the interest of time, I won't say more, but there's lots more to the topic.
Okay. I'll take fish for 400. When patients or conference attendees ask me the question, well, what about fish? If I'm feeling flippant, I'll say, well, what about them? But the question I typically ask them, I said, let's say you were someone or an animal that had to eat lungs. That's all you could eat. Would you eat the lungs of an animal raised in a coal mine? And everybody scratches up their face, of course not, because it'd be filthy. They'd be full of coal dust and tar and God knows what else. Well, the oceans are filthy. They are loaded. We dump sewage and all sorts of industrial wastes and toxins in them, and fish have to filter that to breathe. So fish tissue is actually some of the animal tissue that has the highest loads of toxins of anything someone can put in their body. So that is a problem, and it's not just the mercury, it's also PCBs, it's pesticide residues, I mean, you name it, on and on down the line. But also, because of all of the fertilizers we are dumping into the oceans, we are creating these algae blooms where these toxic algae blooms release these toxins into the water that are also taken up by fish. And studies have shown that people from certain areas who eat a lot of fish are at higher risk for developing what is colloquially known as Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. It's what Stephen Hawking had. It's generally a relentlessly debilitating and ultimately fatal neurologic disease. And there's also some suggestion from certain studies that these algal toxins are also related to Parkinson's and possibly dementia risk. But the bottom line is fish flesh is animal flesh. And as Garth has pointed out, as we've talked already, higher intakes of animal tissue correlate with increased mortality, a higher risk for cancer because it turns on cancer genes. Not to mention the fact that you have all of the cancer-causing compounds that comes from cooking the fish, and then, of course, it does increase TMO, which is another toxin. And so the bottom line is, let the fish swim and be happy and eat your plants.
I don't feel strongly about it. How do I treat UTIs with antibiotics? Yep, thank you.
There actually was a report in the last 2 weeks, again, of lower UTI rates in vegetarians. I didn't read the study in detail, and some of it is handling the chicken in the kitchen and the same
Oh, yeah,
E.
there was a lot
coli
with
that
handling that.
strains.
Yeah.
Exactly, so.
But I guess,
and there
let
is
me just build
there's some
second.
preventive value from cranberry.
Cranberry juice, there's,
But
preventive value. But
modest
to
effect.
treat an infection, again, I think I mentioned this a bit on my talk today. Food is medicine, but it is not the only medicine, and there will be times that we need Lipitor, and there are times that we need antibiotics. And I have seen some very, very sick people who refused to use medicines until it was almost too late. So don't get into that idea that Western medicine is absolutely terrible. It's not. It's good at sick care. It's not good at health care, but it's good at sick care.
Yeah, agreed. I made the same point earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have the opportunity to rely on diet and lifestyle as primary medicine, and everyone can benefit, and then a lot fewer of us will need a lot fewer medications. But when we happen to need one, it's a good thing that we have them. Rates of stroke have declined primarily because of effective treatment of hypertension, which is genetic. Sometimes some people eat optimally, they're still hypertensive. Effective drugs that they tolerate well may be the difference between having a stroke and not. So yeah, I completely agree there. There are only a couple questions left. I guess one of the remaining ones was that 21 of 21 august organizations cite a link between higher intake of saturated fat and higher rates of heart disease and other bad stuff. Yeah, that's because it's true. That's it.
What I want to add.
I would add,
I think Pam has a.
No, I wanted to say something about the UTIs and
Yeah,
responsibility.
no, so, I'm being a little bit glib, but, for example, last night on the panel, Colin, I think argued against saturated fat, placing the emphasis on animal protein. I'm a pragmatist, so, yes, I do believe the evidence regarding the mechanistic adverse effects of saturated fat. I also believe the mechanistic adverse effects of animal protein, but we eat foods. And the simple fact is that we get our excess of animal protein and our excess of saturated fat from all the same sources. I think one of the ways to sidestep a lot of unnecessary controversy, generate a lot more light and quite a bit less heat, is to talk about foods, which I think is the native predisposition of this group anyway. When we say whole food, plant-based, we're talking about whole foods. Okay, then what are the foods? Diets made up predominantly or exclusively of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, and water when you're thirsty. And then, frankly, you're avoiding the animal protein, you're avoiding the saturated fat, you fix a host of ills. Fixate on any one nutrient, there are still ways to get the foods wrong. And, let's be clear, you could be strictly vegan on a diet of Coca-Cola and cotton candy. That wouldn't make it a good idea, right? So saturated fat's not the only thing wrong. Get the foods right, the nutrients tend to sort themselves out.
I just wanted to add something about the UTIs, and that is that I agree, you have a UTI, you give an antibiotic, but we get people in our office who have 6 UTIs a year, and they take antibiotics again and again, and nobody ever stops to say, why do you keep getting these UTIs? And so, and plus, you do this for 3 or 4 years, and antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections are life-threatening, and we have to be more conscious of that, I think, in medicine. So you can deal with UTIs a little bit differently, and you have to. By the time somebody's had 24 rounds of antibiotics, that's not fixing anything, and in fact, the next one comes more often. So we look at hydration. We look at using plant antimicrobials and with very high dose probiotics to restore, to address the infection without more antibiotics, and also to restore the immune system, which has been completely wiped out, or the microbiome, which has been completely wiped out, and it adds increased susceptibility. And then using cranberry juice not from concentrate, mixed in with raw honey, because raw honey has antibacterial properties, and there are studies in medical journals about this. So drinking cranberry juice, you have to sweeten it with something anyway, or your lips will wrap right around the bottle, it's so sour. So if you do these things, it takes some time, but we have people who've had 5 to 6 UTIs a year for 5 and 6 years and wiped it out like they never have another one again. And so I think one time antibiotic, don't worry about it, but if it's repetitive, you have to say something's going on here, and before we really do some damage with the antibiotics, we should look at why and fix that.
just a quick thing on the saturated fat, because it comes up a lot, and you will hear about this study, which was called the Siri-Torino study, which was the study that really started all the saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease. It was sponsored by industry, as you might imagine, but they did a kind of a simple trick. They took a bunch of different, it was a meta-analysis, they looked at a bunch of different studies. You got to understand that these studies, they're trying to show a relation between saturated fat, or lack of relation between saturated fat and heart disease. They controlled for independent risk factors of heart disease, one of those being cholesterol. So you understand the problem here. If you control for cholesterol, one of the methods that saturated fat causes heart disease is by raising cholesterol. So again, if I take this big group of people and I say everybody in you that are out here that have high cholesterol, leave the room, I've kind of eliminated all the people that are being affected by saturated fat. And so therefore, I'm kind of making the game play in my favor, which is what they did with that study and how we started with this whole wait, saturated fat isn't bad for you.
Yes. I know we have 2 minutes per question, and the question that I'm taking is not a 2-minute question, so I might just pick a little fraction of the question, and that was the one about specific nutrients like vitamin D and DHA, and what other ones were there in that long?
Vitamin D, DHA, EPA, iodine, taurine, vanadium, chromium, and omega-3s.
Yeah, no. So we'll do omega-3s and vitamin D, maybe iodine. I'll tackle 3 as quickly as I can. I'll start with iodine because that's a really quick one. What we know is that this is a very critical nutrient, a lack of which is certainly the leading cause of mental retardation in children in the world. So that's something we need to take care of. The key sources in the diet are generally fish and seafood and dairy products because we use iodine to clean the teats of the cows. And so, I mean, we iodize salt to help prevent these kinds of deficiency in the population, and a lot of vegans don't like to use iodized salt. And so we do, especially in Europe, see much higher rates of iodine insufficiency in those populations. So what we need to do is figure out a reasonable source of iodine for people, and that would be, I mean, certainly people who are willing to use iodized salt or just iodine supplement, or certainly seaweed, because seaweed is loaded with iodine. Now, so loaded that you can easily reach the upper limit of 1,100 micrograms of iodine eating a lot of seaweed. And one of the foods that I would avoid in the plant-based world is hijiki, because of the hijiki is a very, very high in heavy metals, and so many countries avoid against its use for that reason. So anyway, if you're using seaweed as your primary source of iodine, it's maybe 1/10 of a teaspoon of kelp. Kelp is super concentrated in iodine, and if you're using nori, it's about 1.5 sheets of nori for 150 micrograms. You can use, I think it's about 1 gram of wakame or arami. So those are all reasonable options for iodine. And vitamin D, well, certainly the sun is the very best source of vitamin D. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that live in very cool climates that are not exposed to any warm sunshine for several months of the year. And some are rich enough to go to Hawaii or other lovely spots to get sunshine, but not everyone is. And for those people, I think that it's a reasonable thing to supplement with vitamin D. Now, vitamin D for the omnivorous population, the main sources are fish and eggs and of course milk that's been fortified with vitamin D. We are fortifying some of the non-dairy milks with vitamin D, but still not people probably don't consume enough of those to meet their needs. So it is reasonable to have a vitamin D supplement in that case. And then the DHA, EPA, omega-3 fatty acids is a huge debate within the plant-based world right now. As many people know, there's a segment of the leadership of the sort of plant-based movement who are saying that we probably should not be taking direct sources of EPA and DHA. So here's what we know. We know that vegans have low levels of EPA and DHA. We know that EPA and DHA are very biologically active, essential, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. Technically, they're not considered essential. They may be conditionally essential if you can't convert alpha-linolenic acid. There's a series of elongations and desaturations that allow us to produce EPA and DHA. In young women, that conversion can be quite efficient. Where there was a study in the UK showing about 36% of ALA was converted to either EPA, DPA, or DHA. And it was about 21% to EPA and about 9% to DHA, which is really quite remarkable. But if you think about it, a young woman has to be prepared to grow a baby and a brain. And so I can imagine that they would have reasonable conversion ability. In young men, it was a 16% conversion, about, I think, 8% to EPA, 8% to DPA, and nothing to DHA. And so, you know, to be honest, we don't know what ideal really is. We don't know if vegans absolutely need to be taking preformed. There are very few sources of preformed long-chain omega-3 fatty acids in the plant kingdom. Seaweed has a little bit of EPA, no DHA. But what a lot of people don't know is that EPA and DHA are not made by fish. They are made by microalgae. And these are tiny plants in the ocean, and that's where fish get them at some point along the food chain. And so many people are now culturing these microalgae to be able to provide people who don't eat fish with a direct source of EPA and DHA. Do we need it? We don't know. However, what we do know is that that some people have increased needs, pregnant and lactating women, so it may be an advantage to get a little bit more. And we also know that some people have a reduced production of the desaturase enzymes responsible for the conversion. So, for example, people with diabetes and hypertension, people who come from regions where for generations fish was a major staple within their diets, they may not produce as much. And so for those individuals, it may make sense to boost intakes a little bit with a direct source of EPA and DHA. So there's still controversy. There's still a lot we don't know. In my opinion, I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to take a small amount a couple of times a week that would sort of approximate what fish eaters might get eating fish a couple of times a week. And certainly we do need to make sure we're getting enough alpha-linolenic acid, and this is the plant omega-3 that we find mainly in chia seeds and flax seeds and hemp seeds and walnuts. We also, about half of the fat in leafy greens is omega-3, but the fat in greens is so dilute, it's not a very rich source of fat. So you would have to eat like a horse or a cow to get enough. You would want to be eating about 20 to 40 cups of leafy greens a day to get 2 to 4 grams of omega-3s. So we need to supplement that with some more concentrated sources of omega-3s. And I think I'll just leave it at that.
Brenda, I want to append something quickly. I think I mentioned last night, I agree with my friend Walter Willett about almost everything. We do have at least one small disagreement. Walter mentioned last night, for those of you who are here, that we shouldn't worry at all about omega-6 fatty acids, and no matter how much we get, it doesn't matter. It's actually strong research in the lipidology literature. Tom Brenda in particular, who is at Cornell, now at UT Austin, done studies showing that a very high intake of omega-6 interferes with that pathway you just described. So the conversion of ALA to DHA in particular is actually effectively blocked by a very high intake of omega-6. So where are you going to get a very high intake of omega-6? Expressed oils used in processed foods. So lots of corn oil, lots of soybean oil, safflower, sunflower. So in general, these may be okay. But if they make up a big part of your diet, they effectively block the pathway, make it more likely that your DHA levels are going to be very low.
Yes, and in defense of Walter Willett, I think what we've found more recently in the literature is that whereas we used to think omega-6 was very pro-inflammatory, that we're seeing that it's not so pro-inflammatory. However, we do need to put a lid on omega-6 because it can, see that it's the same enzymes that convert the omega-6s and the omega-3s. And if we get a lot of omega-6s, it
Occupies
can
the pathway,
preferentially
right.
convert the omega-6s, and you get a reduction of conversion of omega-3s of up to 40 to 60% when you eat a lot of omega-6s. Omega-6s, you're talking safflower oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, grapeseed oil. So you're not wanting to be consuming
And
a lot of
traditionally
these
soybean.
foods.
But you have, so if you're mostly eating whole foods and getting your fats from there, or if the oil you use preferentially is extra virgin olive oil, you avoid this problem anyway. So the whole food approach is effectively a solution to the omega-3 excess. Yeah, so I agree. What Walter
Absolutely.
focused on was inflammatory effects, but the fact is an imbalance and an excess of omega-6 may have some adverse metabolic
Yes,
effects.
particularly for people who are not consuming direct sources of EPA and DHA like
Right.
vegans.
Right.
So it's much less of an issue for omnivores who are consuming direct sources if they're eating fish. There are other dietary factors that can slow conversion as well. Trans fatty acids, saturated fats, a lack of specific nutrients, certain vitamins and minerals and protein, alcohol. So we need to be consuming a well-balanced diet to maximize conversion. We know aging can reduce conversion. So as we get older, we convert less efficiently. Gender, there are lots of factors that can affect conversion ability. So, yeah, thank you for.
One thing I want to add about this, I appreciate your saying, Brenda, about we are not clear on this, about this omega-3 situation and EPA and DHA. And I think this is an important clarification because we have some people in our movement who are basically making claims that the lower levels of DHA, for example, in vegans, is a dangerous thing. It's already been decided. This is going to lead to disaster. We're all going to be demented or something like that. And this is a ridiculous statement to make. We simply don't know. And I think that when we don't know, we should say we don't know, because when we go out there with a great deal of bravado and make a claim about something that's patently false, what you're hoping is that there's not a smart person in the room who knows that it's patently false. And I don't think you can build a business or promote a movement that is dependent on not smart people listening to your message. So I appreciate that clarification. The other thing is you mentioned about diabetics, for example, having lower levels. And what we see is people who are sick have lower levels of a lot of things. There's a good deal of evidence that lower vitamin D levels are more a function of people being in poor health than anything else. There's one very good study that illustrates the point, lots of them, but this one's really crystal clear. People arriving at an emergency room in Georgia, hyperglycemic enough that they had to go to the hospital. Their vitamin D levels were 12.3 when they got there, and as soon as their glucose levels stabilized, they went up to 27.3. All right? So you can see the foolishness of doing intervention with vitamin D for diabetics, thinking it's somehow going to make them better because diabetics have low levels of vitamin D. So I think when we look at which comes first, is it the low vitamin D that's contributing to the disease, or the disease that has caused the low D, or the low DHA, or whatever? We have to be careful that we're actually looking at what is causing what before we go off the deep end and say, oh my gosh, you're eating a vegan diet, you have to take these supplements, or you're pre-diabetic, so if you take these supplements, it's going to somehow help you. So I think that clarification needs to be made.
Do you guys, when I look at vitamin D to try to decide whether or not someone needs vitamin D, one of the primary roles of vitamin D is to allow calcium absorption in the intestine. So I look at parathyroid hormone. Do you guys look at parathyroid hormone to see whether or not their vitamin D is actually affecting their calcium? Does anybody else do that? Am I the only one who checks parathyroid hormone?
Only if they're hypercalcemic, we'll check it.
But I mean, if they're normocalcemic, but they've got a high parathyroid hormone, that means their body, because you could be normocalcemic and still be low in calcium.
Yeah.
And so then I say, okay, well, your vitamin D needs to be supplemented in that situation. I don't, yeah, no.
The review
2
showed
minutes
that
on sugar and heart disease. I had an opportunity to make this statement that was quoted on the Joe Rogan Experience, September 2018, that I've been in heart arteries as an interventional cardiologist 15,000 times, and I've never scooped out sugar, because you can actually do a procedure and scoop out plaque. 1913 was the first year Anichkow identified that in atherosclerosis there is cholesterol. Then we fed mice high cholesterol diets, they developed plaque. That led and many other data points, and I think 11 Nobel Prizes to what's been called the cholesterol hypothesis, that serum cholesterol has a relationship to the development of the #1 killer of men and women. Very seminal in this data was Ansel Keys. You've heard his name a couple times. Dr. Willett showed a slide from the 7-country study. I'll show another one tomorrow at lunchtime. And that was the leading hypothesis. And if you think the food wars are ugly now at times, in the 1960s came an Englishman named John Yudkin who had the contrary view. It's sugar, it's not cholesterol. Dr. Ansel Keys published a paper about sugar and atherosclerosis where he castrated a scientist, as well as any scientist can castrate their fellow scientists, looking at every data in the world and saying it's hardly sugar compared to the potency of cholesterol in plaque, cholesterol in the serum, and the dietary influences that raise that. All that percolated along till a couple years ago when we did find out that there were a few scientists, not Ansel Keys, that did actually take some money from the sugar industry to taint the conclusion of a very sophisticated paper in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1965 that probably 4 people in the world read. But it just really dirtied the waters, the importance of animal foods contributing to raising cholesterol and the importance of added sugar. What we do know in cardiology, and nobody reviews this better than Kim Williams, there are certainly epidemiologic studies that high levels of added sugar in the diet are associated with high levels of coronary artery disease, sugar-sweetened beverages. Is it that we gain weight and we become pre-diabetic, diabetic, and we become hypertensive and our triglycerides go up and become insulin resistant, or is it that sugar's directly toxic? And there's very little data that sugar's directly toxic to coronary arteries. It's an indirect mechanism. But the only reasonable conclusion, and the joy of a whole food plant diet, is it's naturally low in cholesterol. In fact, it's absent. It's naturally low in fats, generally, and it is certainly naturally low in added sugars if you avoid donuts and cookies. So food quality matters. You've heard that over and over, and so does sugar content. Not fruit, though. We all love fruit, I think. There you go. 3 minutes.
Okay, Dr. Katz had previously let me know he would be stepping out a little bit early. Okay, continuing. I have 5 more questions that each of you can answer one of them. The first one is, how do we protect our thyroid gland against thyroid issues? Number 2, what do you recommend for people with acid reflux? Number 3, what do you recommend for people who have eczema? Number 4, do you recommend mammograms? And if not, do you recommend thermographies? And number 5, what type of treatment would you advise for someone diagnosed with cancer? So the 5 questions again, well, the first one was about your thyroid, second about acid reflux, third about eczema, fourth about whether you should get mammograms on a regular basis or at all, or thermography, and the 5th one is what type of treatment would you advise for someone diagnosed with cancer?
I'm going to leave with Dr. Katz with those 5 questions.
I'll talk about reflux since I'm actually a reflux surgeon, so I do a lot of reflux. The reflux is a complicated disease. It is amazing how many people have it, almost everybody. A lot of it has to do with physiology, with weight, with our diets. There's been some very good studies showing plant-based diet helps. The reason plant-based diet helps is because it's low in saturated fat. There's a muscle at the end of the esophagus called the lower esophageal sphincter. It is loosened by several things. It is loosened up by saturated fat, caffeine, alcohol. So that's why after dinner, a lot of people get really sick and get heartburn. Workup and treatment of this is very complex. We start with lifestyle changes like I do with everybody, plant-based diet, again, not vegan or vegetarian necessarily, but a whole food, plant-based diet, low saturated fat, low caffeine, low alcohol, keep the bed elevated. I do use the medications. There's been a lot of debate lately over whether PPIs, which are Nexium, Prilosec, omeprazole, there's been some debates over whether they may contribute to all kinds of things, such as dementia, osteoporosis, things like that. The data is very circumspect that they do that, though who wants to be on a pill all of your life? Certainly lifestyle changes and getting your weight under control helps. There are certain people where reflux is so bad that just about everything causes them to get severe heartburn. If they bend over, food comes up in their mouth. That's a different story. We do tests for that. I will do a scope where I put a camera down their mouth. Do they have irritation? Do they have changes in the esophageal mucosa that suggest that this acid reflux is really bad? Because that can lead to cancer. In fact, there's been a huge increase over the last 20 years in esophageal cancers of the reflux type, instead of the old type, which is squamous cell. And a lot of those have to do with this changes in the esophagus called Barrett's changes. So if people have that, then we start getting more aggressive. That's when we start talking about surgeries to combat reflux. So I have kind of a whole protocol. It starts with lifestyle changes, medicines if needed. If you get really severe problems, we do endoscopy. We put a little, very smart little device inside the esophagus that measures how much acid is coming up, so I could get a quantitative score. If it's very high, then we may suggest surgery to fix that. Yes, Dr. Mills was mentioning H. pylori. H. pylori is a bacteria that causes not necessarily reflux, but it causes gastritis, like an irritation in the stomach. And we've had a huge increase in H. pylori that has been both documented in the literature, but I have been seeing it like crazy in my patients. And that will give you symptoms of reflux, but it's not true reflux. It's just irritation of the stomach. We do treat that with an antibiotic regimen that is now becoming resistant. So it's a little bit scary with the changes for H. pylori. It used to be that we had very good control of it with antibiotics, but now it's down to 70%. Yeah.
One comment about the H. pylori. The humans have lived with H. pylori for hundreds of thousands of years, and eradicating it, I think, is not necessarily the best thing, because now we know that when you're sterile from H. pylori, it increases your risk of inflammatory bowel disease and reflux, ironically, because that's sometimes the reason why people are treated.
Yeah, that's why I don't actually do biopsies unless I see a problem, because we have found H. pylori, but there's no gastritis. So what do
Yeah.
you do with that? And some people are inclined. So I don't do a biopsy unless I actually see inflamed stomach, and
Right.
then I'll treat it only if there's inflammation.
Right. I'll take mammography. Here's the problem with mammography. It does not reduce the risk of dying of breast cancer. Bottom line. And the only reason to have a screening test is either that it's going to prevent a morbidity of some sort, or it's going to prevent early death. So what you do get when you have mammograms, routine mammograms, and I'm talking about screening purposes here, is you find a lot of things that you really would be better off not knowing about, like ductal carcinoma in situ, which is not cancer. It's a risk factor for cancer. By itself, it doesn't mean very much, but it gets treated like cancer. Lumpectomies, increasingly a number of women getting mastectomies, often radiation treatment and hormonal therapy. I mean, it's astounding how much overtreatment there is. The worst part about it is that these women then become survivors who would have been survivors 5 years. They would have lived 5 years anyway. And it makes the cancer industry look like it's doing a whole lot better, because you take a bunch of people who don't have cancer, you treat them as if they have cancer, and the numbers get better, and they're all out racing for the cure and the whole 9 yards. It's just a despicable distortion of what should be going on. Thermography is no better. In fact, if anything, it suffers from more inclination to find even smaller abnormalities that are meaningless. And there's such inconsistency in the way that the thermograms are read. No two people come up with the same answer. The longer they look at various images, the worse that they get. So the studies are pretty abysmal. One just real short story I'll share with you. I was driving to work one morning, and I turned on the radio. I don't know what station, but somebody was talking on a talk show talking about the race for the cure in Central Park. And she was a famous person. I don't know who she was, but she was in charge of it. She was like the figurehead person. And the person interviewing her said, "Tell me your cancer story." And she said, "Well, I had a mammogram last February, and it was clear. And then in September, I found a lump, and it turned out to be stage 3 cancer. So fortunately, this happens all the time. So it's an interval cancer. These are the ones that grow in between mammograms. So fortunately, thanks to modern medicine, I had treatment and chemotherapy, and now I'm fine." Well, it's a year later. I don't think we know she's fine done yet. But in any case, at the end of the interview, after all about the race in the park this Sunday, the interviewer says, what advice do you have for women? And I just almost drove my car off the road. She said, well, you know how we are. We always want to take care of everybody but ourselves. And so take the time and go get that mammogram. You know, it'll save your life. And I thought, listen, lady, you just told everybody about how you found the cancer a few months after the mammogram told you you were clear. And it doesn't save your life. So here, one last thing I want to say about this. One of the most insidious things about all this screening that we do, with the exception of cervical cancer screening, which really does work, is people drink the medical Kool-Aid and think that they're protected. All right, so basically what happens is they get their mammogram results back and it's clear, and they think, you know what, somewhat in the back of the mind, eating cheese pizza and having wine for dinner every night's working out pretty well for me, along with sitting on the couch. I'll do it for another year, and then I'll go get tested, and I'll see if I'm still getting away with it. And we've got to stop doing that. A clear mammogram is not, first of all, it doesn't mean anything, but the second thing is this type of incessant screening is giving people a very false sense of security about their health, and it's a very disingenuous, destructive thing that we're doing.
I will say this, because in a prior entity, I used to be a breast surgeon, and I quit because I could not stand the mammogram. But it wasn't any kind of insidious. I was cutting breasts out medical legally. Like, as soon as you get that mammogram and it says you've got this, you have to cut it out, because otherwise you will be sued. The lawsuits in breast surgery, and I could not stand all the, it turned out we were looking back at our data and we found I think it was like 6% actual breast cancer of all the biopsies and breast tissue that I was taking out. And so it's a tough world. I don't know the right answer. I mean, MRIs are extremely sensitive. So they will pick up the cancer, but they will also pick up 100 other things that aren't cancer.
Right.
And I found myself whittling away at women's breasts until I was like, gosh, you should just get a mastectomy. Also, I didn't get sued, so I quit that.
Thank you.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the cancer question. First of all, I think it's important to understand, we talk about cancer as though it's one thing. And cancer is not one thing. Cancers arrive in different tissues, and cancers of different tissues have different characteristics. So you have blood cancers, like leukemias, which are very different from solid masses. And even within the category of solid tumors, a solid tumor in your lungs carries a very different prognosis from a solid tumor in the testes or the prostate, and so on. So the number one thing we have to understand is that, you know, cancer is not just one disease, and you can't just assume that one approach is going to fit every type of cancer. Now, that being said, the question was, well, how do you treat cancer? What would you recommend? All right. In the interest of transparency, I am a critical care doctor, not an oncologist. So one of the first things I would do is look for an oncologist I respected to refer the person to. But what the question I think is getting at is, what do I think is the best approach to it? And I want to share some stories from some people that I've met to kind of illustrate what I think. 2 years ago, I was invited to Ireland to speak at the Reg Fest. Afterwards, I met this young man. He's Greek. He told me that he had been in the Greek army, training for the Olympics. He was lifting weights. He was a 400-meter runner, and he thought he had to eat, mainly red meat, which is what he was doing until he started noticing abdominal pain, blood in the stool, got worked up, and he had stage 3 colon cancer, a large mass with evidence of metastasis. And I was expecting him to say, I then had surgery and changed my diet. That's not what he said. What he said was, in essence, I eventually became completely raw vegan. I did not do surgery. I did not do chemo. I did not do radiation. And over a 6 to 8 month period, the tumor regressed and all the cancer markers went to 0. And at that point, he was 7 years out. He effectively cured himself with diet change. Last February, I met a woman down in Alabama who in 1996 was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. Stage 3 breast cancer, according to conventional medical dogma, is a death sentence. Women are told, we can treat you, we'll give you a lumpectomy or a mastectomy, followed by radiation and chemo, which will buy you some time, but eventually the cancer is going to come back and it's going to kill you. She had a pecan-sized lump that was removed, and 11 of 17 lymph nodes were positive for the cancer. She had stage 3 breast cancer. She decided that after her lumpectomy, she was going to go completely vegan. She went raw vegan for about at least 6 months, and over that time, her tumor markers went to 0, and as I said, this was 1996. This woman is down there teaching plant-based classes in Alabama. I just met another woman who was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer 3 years ago. She actually went to the Hippocrates Institute. I think she had the initial mass removed, but then she became completely vegan. Again, she was raw for about 8 months before she started weaning cooked foods back in, and she's 3 years out and by all appearances cancer-free. Met another gentleman who in 2013 was diagnosed with stage 4 liver cancer, told, dude, you got 6 months, get your life together because you're not going to be here. He went to see a vegan practitioner in Washington, D.C., and put him on a vegan diet, again, raw for a minimum of 6 months. And Frank is here, still alive, cancer-free, I guess 7 years out now. So what I'm saying is that there clearly is great power within plant foods to help treat cancer. Now, can I tell any given individual that this is going to cure your cancer? No, but what the data do show, and this is just general medical data, that those who change their diet post-diagnosis, given all cancers, to a diet that includes more or mostly plant foods and fruits and vegetables, that it will increase their overall survival. It also increases time to their cancer-free survival. So we know, even within the conventional medical literature, that plant foods are having an effect. And there are these admittedly anecdotal cases that I just mentioned of people who actually, by all appearances, were able to cure themselves of cancer by using a plant-based diet. My point is this: plant foods have power. They have potent anti-cancer properties. This we know. I'm sorry, I got my chin down. This we know from, again, a number of different studies. We need more research. We need to figure out what the hell is happening in these people who do have these cures. And what is it about, particularly, a raw plant food diet that seems to have such bioactivity against cancer cells. And if anybody came to me with cancer, I would talk to them about the various options, conventional modalities, whether, like if I had been in Emmanuel's, that's the Greek gentleman's shoes, I would have said, cut out what you can cut out and then I'm going to be going raw. But he was bold enough to just do it with diet alone. Obviously, it's each individual's decision, but whatever they did, I would strongly urge them to be on a strictly plant-based diet, because we know that animal protein and animal food feeds cancer. And the analogy I use is, if your house catches fire, it makes no sense to have the fire department in the front yard pouring water on it while you're in the backyard throwing kerosene into the house. It's just going to eventually burn down. And so when you get a cancer, you've got to stop doing the things that are feeding those cancer cells, causing the inflammation that's driving the cancer, and that's an animal food-centered diet.
But I would say this, because of course I say that, but as a cancer surgeon and having done, man, please go and see an oncologist and don't say that. You know, if an oncologist was here, they would go crazy with the anecdote on the colon. I've seen colon people come in and, oh my God, had they just gotten the colon surgery done earlier, they would have lived a long, healthy life.
As I said, I would have done the surgery, and
Yeah.
I'm not recommending this.
Don't
I'm
take it
just,
as- yeah.
I'm saying that what it shows is that plant foods have
Yeah.
power against cancer, but that I would never, like, and I said,
Yeah.
the first thing I would do is
It's go,
recommend
right.
someone
I just
to
wanna
a-
make sure the
an
audience gets
oncologist
that he said
that I
that
respected.
because, yeah.
But, you know, it has to be the individual's decision.
I mean, if you look at Ornish's study with prostate cancer, he took the blood of the vegans and
Right.
dripped it on
The
agar
cancer
gels
cells
with
and it
cancer
killed
cells,
it.
and it killed them. So there's definitely an advantage to vegan diet, but there's certain diseases. If I got pancreatic cancer, I'll try anything.
Right.
Give me what you got. I used to do a surgery where we cut out the pancreas. I wouldn't get that done. But there are certain surgeries, colon cancer and breast cancer, that are very treatable now. The rates of cancer death from breast cancer and colon cancer are going down dramatically with some of our treatments. If I had glioblastoma, yeah, I mean, I would ask say, what should I do?
Right.
But there are situations where I definitely would still go and see an oncologist.
I also know of a vegan woman who had stage 4 ovarian cancer, which is essentially uniformly fatal. She had the debulking surgeries, she had the intraperitoneal chemotherapy, she did all of that, plus she went raw vegan, and she is like at least 12 years out, which is, again, anecdotal, but unheard of. So my fundamental point is just to say plant foods have power, and that whatever modality of treatment you use, you got to make sure that being 100% plant-based is part of it.
Great.
There, not to be the Debbie Downer, there was a published study in the urology literature 2 weeks ago of 400 men with prostate cancer, which is about 4 times larger, I think 4 times larger than Dr. Ornish's study published in 2005. The setup was, if plants are so good, the control group should try and eat 5, and the intervention group should try and eat 10 servings a day. There wasn't any difference in outcome recurrence.
But they weren't
didn't ask
vegan. They
them to
weren't vegan,
reduce.
though,
They
right?
didn't ask them to reduce
Yeah.
meat and dairy. So it may be that that's not enough, right? But it is, it is out there, and the headlines are all over that vegetable-heavy diet had no impact on cancer. It's just brand new and still relevant. Thyroid, 2 minutes, maybe 1 minute. I'm not an endocrinologist. However, there's hyperthyroidism, Graves' disease, an autoimmune disease. Maybe you've been radiated as a child. There are people that take excess iodine and drive their thyroid into a kind of a manic state. So if you're supplementing with iodine, it's about 150 micrograms a day, not 15 grams a day, as one of my patients recently just did, and induced hyperthyroidism. But the relationship between diet and Graves' disease, I don't think is well known. Autoimmune diseases may be sick gut. Plant diets may be better for leaky gut. These are all concepts. I don't think it's been tested. Hypothyroidism, studied in the Adventist Health Study, where again they segregated vegan versus lacto-ovo versus pesco-vegetarian versus omnivores, was lower. The most common thyroid disease, hypothyroidism, was less frequent in the vegan population in Loma Linda. There's one woman who ate 4 pounds of bok choy a day, reported in the literature, that developed goitrogen and myxedema coma, severe hypothyroidism. Don't eat 4 pounds of bok choy a day, apparently. There's not a lot of cases, even though there's a whole lot of discussion about cruciferous vegetables and thyroid health. I mean, it's the rainbow. It's rotate. It's don't eat any single food to excess would be a pretty good principle.
Just one thing I'll add to that. High estrogen levels are related to hypothyroidism that isn't autoimmune. And so the relationship between eating a plant-based diet is that even before the weight loss starts, the estrogen levels come down, and I think that's one of the mechanisms for the positive effect.
And maybe xenoestrogens, all that you're getting from animal products directly.
And I think the last item on the menu here is eczema. And eczema is definitely not my area of expertise. I could take a stab at it and say that I think we need a very anti-inflammatory diet and make sure we're not eating things we're sensitive to. And I think, Pam, you could probably say a lot more about it, but anti-inflammatory diet, of course, means you want to reduce pro-inflammatory foods like meat with a lot of heme iron, for example, and anti-inflammatory foods, colorful fruits and vegetables, lots of herbs and spices, fermented foods, green tea, all sorts of other plant matter, and in a very unprocessed form. And I think that's what we've been talking about. That's all what we're trying to do. But certainly for some people, I'm sure it's just a sensitivity to some food, and it could be almost anything. And so it's not always easy to figure out what it is. An elimination diet may be the answer, but I think you could probably add a lot more.
I'll just add a couple of things. First of all, eczema is a pretty good predictor of future autoimmune disease. So if you can stop it, it often prevents more bad things from happening. The two food intolerances that are most common is dairy and gluten. And if you take those foods out of the diet, follow Brenda's guidelines for an anti-inflammatory diet and take high-dose probiotics, usually you can get rid of it. And people who are compliant do get rid of it, and often that's just the end of their immune dysfunction journey.
Thank you.
Do you use a special probiotic? Like when you say high-dose probiotic, what are you using?
Well, it depends on the person. If you're a practitioner and you're going to use these in practice, I always tell people, find a company that you have confidence in, that doesn't put their stuff on the shelves, because the longer it sits, the more it degrades. It really doesn't have much to do with refrigeration as much as time on the shelf. So we found a company in Canada that ships the stuff to us like next day.
But do you order like a certain, like in your eczema patient, a certain microbiome and
well,
weight
it
loss a
depends.
different one?
Well, it depends on what's going on with them. So for example, a really gassy, bloated person, if you give them a high-dose probiotic with some type of prebiotic in it, they won't be able to leave the house. They'll be so miserable. So you do have to tailor the product and to the person in terms of what you recommend to them.
What
And
about bacterial strains? Any particular
yeah,
ones?
yeah.
Like Bifidobacter for
Yeah, you
bowel.
start with the two-strain product, because the Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus are the two strains that seed the gut in the beginning. So we get some of these people who've had 24 rounds of antibiotics and they've taken prednisone, they take NSAIDs every day. I mean, there's nothing down there. So for those people, we start with, if they're in really bad shape and uncomfortable from a GI perspective, we'll start with a low-dose two-strain product and then work our way up from there until we get to medical food. But I think it's best to get these from practitioners who have confidence and suppliers who do studies on their products. I don't like structure function claims. I like companies who do research on their products.
Do you use fecal transplants?
Well, you can't really use fecal transplants in the United States legally unless other than to treat C. diff. We've had people go to Thailand and get fecal transplants because they had the money to do it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of pressure on the FDA from the drug companies who finance the FDA to not allow this to go forward. There's really not much that can go wrong. One study that was done on autistic children, for example, showed that fecal transplant within 12 weeks allowed for something like 14 months within just a few weeks, 14 months of developmental gain. Because autistic children it's a gastrointestinal problem to a certain extent. So it should be allowed, it should be available to everybody, but the FDA is doing everything they can to make sure that it's not. And I have physician friends who are gastroenterologists who would be happy to do fecal transplant on lots of patients, but are just not allowed to.
Okay. 1 minute on these answers.
We did not adhere to the 1
Okay.
minute, Steve, at all.
So these are really 1 minute, for real. This is almost a yes or no question, just to get these in. Yes or no, no more than 1 minute. Should women going through menopause take hormones or bioidentical hormones or any type of medicine to help them? That's question one. Question two, should we avoid heating oils? Do they turn into carcinogens when you heat an oil? In other words, should you put your olive oil on your quinoa after it's cooked as opposed to cooking with it? Question three, what is an acrylamide? Does it mean that we shouldn't eat cooked food? Question four, do you recommend colonoscopies? Question five, do you recommend we learn from some of these companies about our genes and our DNA that'll analyze our DNA and genes to let us know about potential health issues? Just 1 minute on each.
Yes, on the colonoscopies.
Yes, on the colonoscopies.
Yes, and the colonoscopy. But there is Cologuard if you're very low risk and have had a negative colonoscopy, so we're still evolving that.
There's not a single randomized trial that has ever shown that colonoscopy reduces the risk of dying of colon cancer, and the Canadians took it off their list in 2016 as a result.
I would tell you that I have saved people's lives like you cannot believe with colonoscopy, like unbelievably so. And a vegan too, like unbelievably so.
I believe you.
I mean, like so much so that I can't, like they would have died.
I understand that.
I'm
but
getting a
here's-
colonoscopy next
But
week.
here's the thing. What we have to do is put the right data in front of the patient and let them decide. And it would be disingenuous to say that colonoscopy reduces the risk of dying of colon cancer because there are no studies saying that. And it is okay to say there are no studies saying it. Somebody may still opt to get the colonoscopy because of family history or whatever, but the bottom line is it is important to tell people the truth. That's all I'm saying. I'm sure colonoscopy does save some lives. And by the way, there are people out there, every time I give a talk, somebody stands up and says, my sister-in-law's best friend's neighbor's cousin's mother's, it saved her life to have a mammogram. I believe that's true. But when somebody is sitting in front of you saying, should I do it? I think we have to put data in front of them and let them decide.
I mean, there's some good data with Cologuard, but with colonoscopy, I mean, I can't tell you, I could take out a tiny little polyp so easily. A big mass that it will grow into is frightful.
I agree.
And
I agree.
I've got a long history of colon. I can't get your colonoscopy. I can't emphasize. I don't even like get your colonoscopy.
I'll take the gene question in 1 minute. There's certainly no randomized studies that indicate your health will be better and you'll live longer
Yes.
if you have extra samples drawn from saliva, blood, or whatever. I am a participant in a research study in San Diego. It's something called Human Longevity, Inc. They published results in a very prestigious journal last week called Proceeding National Academy of Science, suggesting a more aggressive approach identified earlier disease and leads to better outcome. It's a hypothesis. It's called precision medicine. If you knew your genetic risk was higher for renal cell carcinoma or for colorectal cancer, Alzheimer's, would you make some changes or see a genetic counselor? But it's a hypothesis. And I think we don't know. I mean, I've been through it. You can now get a panel of cancer genes, heart disease, pharmacogenetic genes for $200 by spitting in a cup. It was $2,000, $20,000 just a couple years ago. So it's being priced down where it's possible for many to do it. It's your own. Do you want to know? Do you not want to know? Do you want to know if your gun is loaded and you have to be careful not to pull the trigger or not? And partly it's what we call shared decision making with patients. I favor it. I do a lot of it.
I guess I'll address heating oil. First of all, if you do use oils, they have a smoke point, and so all oils are not created equal. Whenever an oil smokes, you are producing products of oxidation that are potentially carcinogenic. So acrylenes, aldehydes, all sorts of things. And so you really don't want oils to smoke. For a lot of oils, especially if they're fresh pressed oils with a lot of particles in them, they smoke at a very low temperature, including coconut oil, by the way. That's an organic, more natural, there are particles that will smoke at a much lower temperature than a more refined oil. So if you're cooking, I mean, really and truly, probably best if you use oils to not cook them, but if you are cooking them, don't let them get to a smoke point.
Bioidentical hormone, yes, no?
I'll take HRT. I don't recommend it, and bioidentical hormones have not been proven to be safer. And a new study just came out. There are lots of studies. This is just one more. But this one shows that if you take hormones, either estrogen by itself, progesterone and estrogen combination, whatever it is, it increases the risk of breast cancer in a dose-dependent manner. The longer you take it, the higher the risk. And I've never had anybody sitting in my office who said, I know I have breast cancer now, but all those years without hot flashes, it was so worth it. Nobody says that. So I don't think it's a great idea. If women are so miserable that they have to do this for a short time, keep it on a very short string. The sooner you're off of it, the better, in my opinion.
Okay, if everyone would make a 10-second closing statement.
Thank you.
Eat food, only plants, not too much.
Say it again.
Eat food, only plants, not too much.
Eating dead things will make you dead, so eat plants and live.
Ditto. Thank you, guys.
And I'll just leave you with saying that I've enjoyed the privilege of meeting so many of you and being part of the panel and getting to know my co-speakers. And thank you, Steve, for the amazing work you're doing. So thank you.